Welcome to the PRR Middle Division. I'm Jerry Britton, your host. Over the past few weeks, I've been working on finishing this scene, which is the Granville Bridge just west of Lewistown, Pennsylvania. I've gotten a lot of questions from my still photos asking me how I did certain things, what my approach was, stuff like that. So what I decided was to put together a video that talked about the prototype bridge and then how I accomplished certain pieces of finishing the scene. So without further ado, let's get to the description of the prototype bridge. Enjoy. There are two stone arch bridges just west of Lewistown. The first is the Granville Bridge, and the second is the Maze Bridge. The following description is from the Library of Congress, record HAER number PA-534. Heading west from Harrisburg in 1847, Chief Engineer J. Edgar Thompson surveyed a route for the Pennsylvania Railroad that more or less followed the Pennsylvania Canal over the Allegheny Mountains on its way to Pittsburgh. The canal remained on the Juniata River's north bank, which was usually too narrow for the railroad to share. Thompson's route therefore used the south bank from the Juniata's mouth to Lewistown, a distance of about 55 miles. Between Lewistown and Granville, however, a difficult curve in the river made the north bank more favorable. Two long bridges across the river slowed the westward progress of construction, so from the 1st of September to December 24th of 1849, Lewistown was the end of the line. On the latter date, the first of a succession of structures known as the Granville Bridge opened to traffic. Located 1¼ miles west of Lewistown, it carried a single track on 5 120-foot wooden howe truss spans. The first Granville Bridge was destroyed by fire and rebuilt in February 1855. A decade later, an unknown contractor erected new 2-track iron deck trusses on extensions of the existing piers. As part of PRR mainline improvements in 1887, the spans were replaced with stronger trusses. Historic photographs show that these were double intersection Pratt deck trusses. I-bars comprising the diagonal and lower chord members were definitely wrought iron. Tubular vertical members with elaborate end connections were likely cast. Shortly thereafter, PRR completed 3rd and 4th tracks from the Susquehanna River to the east end of the Granville Bridge, but the 2-track bridges at Rockville and Granville continued to limit capacity at either end of this segment. During the spring floods of 1889, the broad Susquehanna failed to dislodge the Rockville Bridge from its piers, but the narrower and faster-flowing Juniata took out 4 of the Granville Bridge's 5 spans. Using a combination of new and salvaged trusses, Pennsy crews managed to put the bridge back in service. Neither the Rockville nor the Granville Bridge would last long into the 20th century, however, as the Pennsy sought to eliminate these 2-track bottlenecks from its main line. The current 4-track stone bridge at Granville, like the much longer structure at Rockville, reflects the PRR's monumental capital investment and desire for permanent structures in the early 20th century. Although Chief Engineer William H. Brown had designed stone arches as early as 1887 at Johnstown, it was a flurry of masonry construction between 1900 and 1906 that earned him a reputation as the railroad's Stone Man. Under the leadership of President Alexander J. Cassatt, the Pennsy spent record amounts tunneling under the Hudson River into New York City, separating passenger and freight traffic in eastern Pennsylvania, and upgrading its main line to 4 tracks across the state. As part of the improvements, Brown and his staff designed notably long and expensive stone arch bridges over the Delaware, Juniata, Raritan, and Susquehanna rivers. The Granville Bridge is significant as a well-preserved example of a medium-length structure built during this period in the railroad's history. It is unclear which of Brown's staff might have designed the Granville Bridge, which was built during the 1905 construction season. Many of its details resemble those of the Rockville Bridge completed 3 years earlier, pointing to design standards for stone arch spans. Even if standards existed, it would have been necessary for a knowledgeable engineer to adapt them to local conditions. The Granville Bridge is possibly the work of assistant engineer Alexander C. Shand, who succeeded Brown as chief engineer in 1906 and played a large role in construction of another bridge at Mount Union. A plaque on the Granville Bridge lists the names of Brown, Shand, and assistant engineer F. M. Sawyer, who supervised construction. The contractor, Iyer Construction of Philadelphia, also receives credit on the plaque. The Granville Bridge is 56 foot wide and has 8 segmental stone arch spans, each 70 feet long. Most of the piers are 8 foot wide, but the middle pier is 16 foot, bringing the total length to 624 feet between abutments. At Rockville, wider piers occur at intervals to resist unbalanced thrust from an incomplete structure, providing convenient stopping points between construction seasons. The much shorter Granville Bridge was completed in a single year, so its wider middle pier probably serves more of an aesthetic function. With an even number of spans, the bridge has no easily identified center. The subtle difference in width draws the eye to the middle pier and balances the composition. Further emphasis is provided by corbelled projections from the spandrel walls at mid-span, providing 3 foot by 16 foot safety niches on either side. These features have a trapezoidal shape and elevation, echoing the Penske's trademark keystone. The Granville Bridge's construction sequence is not well documented, but because of similar conditions in the Susquehanna and Juniata rivers, can be interpolated with reasonable certainty from the Rockville Bridge. All of the Granville Bridge's piers are founded on rock, which lies just below the shallow river's bottom. As with the Rockville Bridge, the arch rings were probably constructed on wooden truss falsework standing in the riverbed. In both bridges, the 42-inch thick rings consist of cut stone voussoirs that contrast with rough ashlar spandrel walls and pier faces. The arches are segmental with a radius of 40 foot 7.5 inches and a rise of 20 feet, from springing to crown. In his description of Penske structures at Lewistown, historian James J.D. Lynch Jr. states that the Granville Bridge was built in longitudinal halves, with the westbound tracks supported in part on the stone piers of the 1889 bridge. It may be true that each ring was built in longitudinal halves using the same falsework twice, as with the Rockville Bridge. Neither structure reused the stone piers of its predecessor, however. At Granville, the old piers still stand upstream of the present bridge. After completing the arch rings, the contractor would have constructed spandrel walls and haunches, which reduced the amount of fill necessary to provide a level rail bed at 7 foot above the arch crowns. Unlike the unreinforced concrete haunches available at Rockville, as-built drawings of the Granville Bridge show a grouted rubble backing, which was probably a less expensive material. Maintenance records indicate alterations in 1927 and 1950. It is unclear on which of these dates steel tie rods were added to the bridge's exterior. This was no doubt done to stop spreading of the spandrel walls and longitudinal cracking in the arch rings. Coping stones have been covered with reinforced concrete on the upstream side of the bridge. Nonetheless, the Granville Bridge appears much today as it did in 1905. It remains in active service, carrying freight and passenger trains. The model of the Granville Bridge was actually constructed as a module on the workbench. It was much easier to work at that level and assemble the plaster pieces that make up the kit. This originally was a kit from Model Railroad Stoneworks, now out of business, and was to depict the Rockville Bridge. But the dimensions of the Granville Bridge are all but identical, so it was a perfect match for me. The kit consists basically of end pieces, which go from the middle of this arch down to the ground and include the wing walls. Then you have the regular arches, which go from the middle of the span here to the next middle, and they go down to the top of the pier, and the pier was a separate piece. So I had to lay out approximately 8 feet of bridge. And I'll note that the center pier is twice as wide as a regular pier, and you'll see that this piece here is wider. Once it was all installed, and it was just plain white unfinished plaster for about 9 years, but I immediately had put the track on, which is a Penske 4-track main line. One thing that's unique about this location is that there's a full 4-track interlocking, and 3 of the crossovers are actually on the bridge deck. And at the far side, there's an entrance into the Lewistown yard. The flat spot you see there is where the tower goes. I have a separate video in the library here on Patreon that shows how I was able to set up the controls for the turnouts without going through the bottom. It was pretty tricky, but it's worked well, so feel free to check out that video on that. The finishing project started with the landforms at the end in non-flooding conditions. Basically 2 arches at each side were above ground. And I started by creating a cardboard mesh, covering it with plaster cloth, and then a layer of Sculpt-A-Mold. And that was done at both ends. Then I caulked the edges of the riverbed, because eventually I'm going to be pouring in the river water, if you will, and it'll find every hole there is and leak through. So I've caulked the edges, so that's ready for pouring. And then I painted the whole bottom a dark brown as a base color. And in a future video, we'll talk about touching that up and enhancing that before we actually pour the water. When I stained, the creator of the plaster molds, he recommends using a little bit of India ink with water. However, having seen how the Bricktown Museum did their bridge out in Mount Union, Pennsylvania, I went their route with Hunterline stains. And basically I used a very dark stain and applied it with a sponge brush that's typically used in crafting, and that gave it the overall light gray look. And then I came back with other Hunterline stains, such as a yellow ochre, and they have a blue one, and just a couple other shades, and I dabbed that on to have some of the rocks stones stand out. Then I went and ballasted the deck. I wanted to have the ballast done early, and that happens to be a location that I may need access to yet, and I have not done the crossovers yet. I'm allowing for a little bit of quality control time, but I wanted to get the edges all done, so from a low angle it would look like it was all done, and it'll minimize ballast dripping over the edge into the other scenery later. So next up, I've got ground cover to install on the edges. I've got to add different colors to represent the bank close to the water, as well as the shallow areas. Add some other details for the shallows. Add the piers for the old bridge, which are still there underneath the new bridge. This will need pipe fence, and at the center pier there were outcroppings of stonework so that crews could get out of the way of passing trains. And then along the edge there's going to be poles that extend out to carry the telegraph wires. What I haven't decided yet is if I'm going to add the steel reinforcing beams to the outside of the bridge. As best as I can figure, they were added in 1950. I'm modeling the early 50s, but quite frankly, I'm not a fan of the look of those beams. So I have to decide if I want to be truly prototypic or let it go as is. The other thing I'll be doing is putting a backdrop in here, I went up to the real bridge a few years ago and flew a drone across, and I was able to get great still photos and had them blown up via an internet site, and I'll share that technique later. And in the coming weeks, you'll see how this all comes together. Thank you for joining us. Tune in later. Thank you.